But I wanted to write about some aspect about China and about women. And those were the two things I knew when I began the first book. And, you know, I was fortunate enough to stumble upon these silk-working women, which gave me everything I wanted to a large extent. It gave me the culture. It gave me a sense of what it meant to be a female Chinese woman during that time. And it gave me a sense of empowerment of what they had done. You know, regardless if they understood what they were doing at the time, they didn't know that they were a subculture that was actually earning money, that actually lived independent of husbands and family, that was actually doing everything that was against what it meant to be in the Chinese culture. You know, and I hadn't heard about them, and I didn't know, and it was perfect. It was exactly what I was looking for. And I can go off now and start preaching about the fact that I think that so many of us Asian American authors and Asian authors in general tend to go back and write about our ancestors and tend to go back and write about things in our past, not our specific past, but maybe the past of our ancestors, our grandmothers, our mothers. We essentially, in my generation, have been telling their stories. I think the generation to come will be telling stories of living here. You know, it'll be very different stories. But I think the oppression of our voices have been for so many, many years. I mean, if you think back, the first writer who was really read in terms of Asian American was probably Maxine Hong Kingston. You know, and I read her in high school, and I still remember being greatly affected by reading The Woman Warrior. But before her, there were very few. There were some, but they never made that huge economic splash. You know, so they were never really read in a large way. But Maxine was the first one in the sense that we started reading her in school, so we knew of her. But she still wasn't out there the same way that Amy Tan had opened the door for us when she wrote the Joy Luck Club. You know, so I mean, so much of it is timing. But it meant that all that history, all those voices before then had been silent. You know, and so my generation of writers came in, and you started to hear stories of the women and the men and the families that were of a different generation. And I think a lot of us have been writing about that because they were silenced for so long. I have been involved with the Kiriyama Book Prize, and I don't know if you've ever heard that, but it's a Pacific Rim Book Prize in which books come from Asia and all over the Pacific Rim. Well, in the last 11 years that it's been a prize, we have read so many books that have come from voices of new writers that I'm always amazed. You know, and they're writing very different stories from what I was writing when I started. So it's a good thing, it's a wonderful thing, because it has opened this door where all these people have come through now. And you know, I mean, if you look at these lists, you read Indian authors, Japanese authors, Chinese authors. You know, and it's just, it's now we're very much diverse, which I think for such a long time we weren't. You know, so I thank you for that question, because if I keep going, I will never get another question.
Thank you for Samurai's Garden. I read it when it first came out, and it's wonderful to be reminded.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. You know, to jump off to a tangent, I was Samurai's Garden, again, because I said it was like this Energizer Bunny. Danville, the city of Danville and San Ramon had chosen the Samurai's Garden at the end of last year. And again, I was thinking, oh, I've got to go talk about Samurai's Garden. Everybody has already read it. It's been out for over 10 years. What am I going to do? So they had it in the Danville Theater, which is this very nice theater. And they actually were doing Romeo and Juliet, by the way. So the balconies and all the set was set up. And then there was me right in the middle of the balcony, and I was kind of waiting for somebody. And it was a very nice audience. And when I walked in, the librarian was ecstatic, and she's going, look at, there's people here. And I'm going, and I thought, oh yeah, there's people here. And she goes, it's almost as good as last year's. And I said, who did you choose for last year? And then she told me, and she said, and the year before. And then she told me, and I said, do you realize that they're dead already? And I'm alive, and shouldn't I be pulling in a little bit more here? So anyway, to go off, thank you for coming.
Oh, my pleasure. But I just this month read your book, Dreaming Water. I'm very glad to have read it, and I'm just wondering two things. There seems to be more of an advocacy voice in terms of, yes, the internment, but the discrimination of being, an Asian American. And secondly, Warner's disease. I'm just wondering how you got into writing about that. And the characters were wonderful.
Okay, to your first question first. To be totally honest, when I sat down to write Dreaming Water, I thought to myself, this is the book that I had finished Language of Threads, and I had written 4 books that all took place in Asia. And because Language of Threads was, I hate this word, but the sequel to Women of the Silk, my first book, I felt that somehow I had come full circle, that somehow my Asia period might have been done, and it was time to move on now, and I wanted to write a book that was more contemporary, and I wanted to write a book that was set in California. And I knew that I wanted to write a mother-daughter kind of storyline, and that was what I began with. And it was the first time, as a writer, I said to myself, this character not necessarily has to be Asian. None of these characters necessarily have to be Asian. So actually, I was of mind opposite of what you're saying, happened through the book. And what happened was, the more I started to research, when I discovered Werner's, because I wanted to write, I was feeling older, physically and mentally, emotionally, just as a person. And I wanted to somehow translate that into a book. And so when I thought I was going to write about this caretaking situation, it was going to be a mother and daughter, I thought, was there an aging disease? Is there some kind of aging disease? And I know that there was progeria. So I'm kind of answering both of your questions at the same time, which is the childhood version, where children grow old very quickly. And so by the time they're 7 or 8, they look like little old people, because they age so quickly. And so the first thing I had asked myself was, is there a version of this disease for older people? In a way, does it start later in a person's life? And as I'm researching, I discover Werner's syndrome. And that's how it came to be that particular disease in the book. And so I thought, this works for me, because then she would have a life before the disease actually started to age her, which is in their early 20s, as opposed to being very, very young. But then the more I researched, the more I realized that a large population of Japanese people seem to have this genetic defect. So it kind of brought me right back to the Japanese culture, even though I wasn't looking for it to a large extent. So what happened was, if she was half Japanese, and here again, you're going to hear some of the writing process. As I'm thinking about this, as I'm thinking about storyline, as I'm thinking about her parents, if her mother is Italian and her father is the Japanese culture, which would make her half and half, and so the genetic defect would come through the father somehow, then things would have to have happened if they grew up in California. He grows up in Pasadena, which means he would have had to have been interned. You see how things start to happen without you looking at it from the beginning of sitting down and writing a story, but as you develop the characters, and the year, and the situation, and the stories that a father would tell a daughter. All this came out. The internment camps, what happened, what he hoped for, what he wished for, all the stories that he tells the daughters. Well, some of them would have to cover that internment time, and a lot of it is what happened from my research. So all that went into the book. Does that answer your question? So in a way, it's not that I purposely sit down and say, now I'm going to advocate this. But if a storyline covers a certain aspect of history, that you tell it to the greatest truth that you can. You talk about the situation, and if you inhabit the characters, hopefully, in the right way, you try to feel what they would feel.